April 18th, 1942. The Pacific dawn is black with storm clouds, and the deck of the USS Hornet shakes under waves taller than houses. 16 bombers sit chained to a wooden flight deck, their wings dripping in salt spray, their engines silent but ready to roar into history. None of the men strapped inside them believe they will return alive. And you shouldn't either. Because what you're about to hear is not the polished version taught in classrooms or documentaries. It is the buried version. The hidden truth of a mission so dangerous, so reckless, that even its architects called it suicide. The world had been told that Japan was untouchable, wrapped in a fortress of ocean and steel, guarded by the divine winds of history itself. But on that day, America would strike the Japanese homeland, an act considered impossible, almost mythical. This was not about territory or resources. It was about psychology, about shattering the illusion that fueled the Japanese empire's expansion. It was about showing the world, and Japan, that no one was safe from retaliation. But here's what they don't tell you. The mission was never meant to succeed in the conventional sense. It was designed as a weapon of fear, an experiment in psychological warfare. The men who flew those planes weren't just pilots, they were pawns on a chessboard of perception. They were sacrificed not for the bombs they dropped, but for the message their raid would carry. Roosevelt didn't demand a strategic victory. He demanded a strike that would stain Japanese pride with fire and humiliation. As the Hornet pushed through typhoon seas, the men were already ghosts in the making. Fuel calculations told them they wouldn't have enough to reach safe bases in China. Their only options: crash, bail out, or fall into enemy hands. They launched anyway. Imagine sitting in the cockpit, rain pelting the glass, the deck so short-wise. You could see the ocean swallowing you before the engines even reached full thrust. You know the odds, you know the math doesn't work. And yet, when the flag drops, you push the throttles forward because history demands it. This was more than a raid. It was a psychological dagger aimed straight at the Empire's heart. But daggers cut both ways, and the men who carried it would pay a price the world has tried to forget. The Japanese called it the impenetrable wall, a defensive perimeter stretching from the Kuril Islands down through the Philippines, fortified with naval bases, airfields, and endless patrol lines. Their generals swore to Emperor Hirohito that no foreign bomber would ever reach Tokyo, that the homeland itself was protected not just by steel and radar, but by destiny. It was the illusion of invincibility, the myth of divine protection. And myths are powerful weapons, until someone dares to break them. That someone was Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a man whose life read like an impossible ledger of firsts. The first to fly coast to coast in a single day, the first to perform aerial stunts no sane man would attempt, the first to master blind instrument flying when others were terrified of clouds. At 45 years old, he was short, unassuming in stature, but inside him burned the dangerous confidence of a man who had already conquered the sky. He was chosen not because he was expendable, but because he believed in impossible victories. The raid itself was born from an accident. A naval officer observing army bombers practicing short takeoffs suddenly asked, "What if we pushed this further? What if medium bombers, too large, too heavy, never intended for carriers, were launched from a ship at sea?" The thought violated every doctrine of war. The Navy dismissed it as madness. The Army laughed. But Roosevelt was desperate, and desperation creates opportunities for madmen. Every B-25 Mitchell bomber was gutted and altered like a patient on a surgeon's table. Gun turrets removed, extra fuel tanks installed where men once crawled, bomb sites replaced with crude devices made from hardware store scrap. Each plane was transformed into a one-way weapon. No guarantees, no promises of survival, just a mission stitched together by willpower and illusion. The Japanese believe that America would take years to recover from Pearl Harbor. They calculated production rates, troop movements, the time it would take to rebuild a shattered fleet. But they miscalculated one thing: The American appetite for risk when pride is at stake. This raid was not about logic. It was about vengeance, spectacle, and psychological shockwaves that would ripple across oceans. Think about it. The Japanese spent years building their wall of safety, and in one day, with 16 bombers balancing on a wet wooden deck, America would prove that the wall was an illusion, that no one, not even an emperor, was beyond reach. Listen closely. This is where the machinery behind the mission becomes uglier than the bombs. Wars are sold to populations with neat narratives, heroes, strategy, righteous fury. But the Doolittle Raid was not a tidy story. It was a deliberate stroke of narrative violence, a manufactured myth packaged for public morale. The architects understood a simple, brutal law of mass psychology. When a people believe they are invulnerable, a single, visible violation of that belief fractures cohesion faster than 1,000 battle losses. So they weaponized perception. Inside Washington and the Navy's planning rooms, debates weren't simply about fuel loads or navigation. They were about headlines and the shape of grief. Roosevelt wanted blood, but he wanted blood that read well on the morning papers, a spectacle that would be digested by civilians and reduced into a simple truth. America struck back. Behind the rhetoric, compromise and calculation reeked of institutional self-preservation. Admirals and generals argued quietly about blame for Pearl Harbor, even as they plotted a raid to shift the national mood and, frankly, to redirect scrutiny away from command failures. This mission was both retaliation and cover. The public would cheer while policymakers rearranged their reputations. Corruption is not always coins changing hands. Sometimes it's the corruption of honesty. Data massaged, risks downplayed, worst-case scenarios filed in closed folders. Engineers at North American aviation and naval officers watched as men in suits signed off on modifications that unnerved them. "We're cutting corners," some muttered. But corners are cut in the name of necessity and in the name of saving face. When a war requires miracles, institutions forge them, then claim the miracle as proof of their infallibility. Meanwhile, propaganda machinery buzzed. Radio announcers prepared scripts that would describe the raid as precision, as strategic genius, as proof that American industry and willpower had already begun to turn the tide. Photographs would be curated, casualties sanitized into noble sacrifice. The messy human fallout, men drowning, captured, tortured, or lost in foreign jungles, would be compressed into emblematic martyrdom. That compression is intentional. It makes men into symbols and symbols easier to manipulate. Yet there were dissenters, rank-and-file mechanics who dreaded the stripped planes, pilots who feared the short deck, radio operators who knew the picket lines might betray them. Their protests were smothered by orders and the pressure of the national narrative. When destiny must be manufactured, truth becomes an inconvenient, expendable thing. Remember that. The Doolittle Raid succeeded in breaking myth, but it also revealed how institutions will cannibalize truth for strategic advantage. You are being taught to admire the blast, to honor the bravery, and you should. But also learn to read the machinery that created the blast. The politics, the reputational calculation, the quiet compromises. This is the darker lesson, the war within the war, and it will show you how power shapes reality long after the smoke clears. April 18, 1942. The order comes down: launch now or abort forever. A Japanese picket boat had spotted the American task force far sooner than expected. Its dying radio signal had already betrayed their presence to Tokyo. Doolittle and his men were supposed to launch within 400 miles of Japan. Instead, they faced an additional 250 miles of hostile ocean. Every calculation told them they would never make it home. But hesitation was death. At 08:20 hours, the first bomber thundered down the deck. Imagine the sensation. You're strapped in, rain lashing your visor, watching the deck tilt and shudder under storm waves. The runway in front of you is shorter than your bomber was ever designed to use. There is no margin, no second chance. A heartbeat too late on the throttle, a fraction off on the lift, and you vanish beneath the bow into the churning sea. Yet one after another, 16 crews gambled their lives against physics, dragging overloaded machines into the air by sheer willpower. The Japanese never considered this possible. Their entire homeland defense system rested on the premise that American bombers could not reach Tokyo, not without forward bases. Yet here they came, engines screaming low over fishing boats, their profiles disguised with false gun barrels painted to resemble fighters. Japanese civilians waved at them, convinced these were their own planes. The illusion of invulnerability was already cracking, and the bombs hadn't even fallen yet. But this was not just about bombs. It was about spectacle. Roosevelt needed headlines, and Japan needed humiliation. The raid was designed as theater as much as destruction. Each bomb dropped was not merely a weapon. It was a sentence written into the Japanese psyche. You are not safe. Your emperor cannot shield you. The Americans can touch you whenever they choose. And yet, beneath this daring defiance, a darker tour. Uth gnawed at every man who launched that morning. They knew their chances of survival were shrinking with every mile. They knew fuel gauges would run dry long before China. They knew capture by the Japanese meant not death, but torture. But they flew anyway, each man becoming both executioner and sacrificial offering in the same instant. This was not courage as the movies portray it. This was courage forced into existence by circumstance, by propaganda, by duty, and by the knowledge that history would remember their names while their bodies were scattered across sea and soil. Tokyo, April 18, 1942. Sirens wail across the city for the first time in living memory. At first, many think it's a drill, an echo of distant exercises. Then the explosions come, thunderous cracks that rip through factories, refineries, and neighborhoods. Civilians pour into the streets in panic, staring upward at the impossible sight, American bombers over the emperor's sacred homeland. Mothers clutch children. Soldiers freeze in disbelief. Prime Minister Tojo himself watches one bomber pass so close he can see the pilot's face. The myth of invulnerability is collapsing in real time. Understand this. The Doolittle Raid caused limited physical damage. A few factories struck, a handful of fires lit. By the metrics of strategic warfare, it was negligible. But in the realm of psychology, it was catastrophic. Japan's leadership had promised divine protection, had assured its people that the homeland was untouchable. Now, with smoke rising above Tokyo, that promise turned to ash. Once shattered, illusions are impossible to fully rebuild. The shock didn't stop with the civilians. Within Japan's high command, paranoia spread like wildfire. If American bombers could appear here, what else was possible? Was their perimeter truly secure? Were spies feeding the Americans' intelligence? Doubt infiltrated every meeting, every conversation, every calculation. And doubt is a disease in war. It corrodes discipline, it sharpens fear, it makes leaders reckless. Reckless, that is the word you must remember. Because the Doolittle Raid pushed Japan into a spiral of decisions that would ultimately seal their fate. To punish China for aiding the Americans, Japanese forces unleashed massacres of staggering cruelty, slaughtering civilians by the tens of thousands, burning entire towns in a frenzy of reprisal. These atrocities are rarely mentioned in the sanitized retelling, but they were the hidden cost of the raid, paid not by Americans, but by innocent Chinese civilians who never saw the inside of a bomber. Meanwhile, Tokyo's military planners accelerated their plans to extend Japan's defensive perimeter further east into the Central Pacific. They aimed to crush American carriers before such a raid could ever be repeated. This urgency led them straight toward a fateful name burned into history: Midway. The Doolittle Raid didn't just strike Tokyo. It shoved Japan into a chain of reckless gambles that would eventually break their empire. So when you think of the raid, don't think only of bombs falling on steel and stone. Think of the cracks it carved into the mind of a nation. Cracks that widened into reckless choices, brutal reprisals, and eventually catastrophic defeat. The American press celebrated the Doolittle Raid as a clean surgical strike. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines, politicians spoke of courage, and families clung to the image of their men soaring home in victory. But behind the curtain, the truth was darker, bloodier, and smothered in silence. Because most of those crews never made it back. Fuel gauges bled toward empty as the bombers left Japan. China was still hundreds of miles away, and the winds had turned against them. One by one, crews were forced into impossible decisions: ditch in the Black Pacific, crash into mountains, or bail out into unknown darkness. Men tumbled from the sky into rain, fog, and hostile territory. Some landed in rice paddies, some in forests, some directly in the hands of waiting Japanese patrols. And here lies the forbidden truth. The raid did not end when the bombs fell. It only began. Of the 80 men who flew, 8 would be captured. They were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as trophies of vengeance. The Japanese military tortured them for months, extracting confessions, beating them until their bodies broke, starving them into silence. Show trials were staged, verdicts predetermined. 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 died of starvation and disease. The rest endured years in cells so small they could not stand upright. Back home, the American government knew, but they could not tell. To admit what had happened would taint the narrative, stain the clean myth of daring triumph. So silence became policy. Official reports glossed over the losses. Families received only fragments of information, carefully worded letters that concealed the horror their sons endured. Propaganda demands heroes, not martyrs rotting in enemy prisons. And so the truth was buried, hidden even from those who deserved to know it most. This is the corruption few dare to discuss. Not corruption of money, but corruption of memory. Institutions shaping the story, amputating the bloody edges so the public consumes a purified legend. The men themselves, flesh, pain, terror, are reduced into a single line. They struck Tokyo and showed the world America could fight back. Ask yourself, how many times in history have you been told a victory when what truly happened was sacrifice repackaged as glory? This is how wars are sold. This is how myths are built. The Doolittle Raid was not a clean strike. It was a brutal descent into captivity, mutilation, and silence, sanitized for your consumption. Propaganda is the second battlefield, the one without smoke or shrapnel, but with consequences just as lethal. After the Doolittle Raid, Tokyo's propagandists rushed to reframe the humiliation. They declared the attack meaningless, the damage trivial, the American bombers cowardly for striking civilians and fleeing. Photographs of smoldering ruins were censored. Newspaper columns insisted Japan's divine shield remained intact. To the Japanese public, the raid was spun as an annoyance, not a disaster. But beneath the surface, fear crept in. If Americans could appear once, they could appear again. The silence between sirens became heavier than the sirens themselves. In America, the opposite theatre unfolded. The press hailed the raid as a decisive blow, a turning point, even though militarily it was almost insignificant. The details of lost crews, botched landings, and tortured captives were buried under patriotic ink. Every headline crafted an illusion of strength. Tokyo burns. America strikes back. In truth, the raid had accomplished little more than a psychological fracture, but that fracture was priceless in wartime politics. Roosevelt himself carefully fed the narrative, using it to shore up public faith and to silence critics who doubted America's ability to hit back. Here is the darker truth. Both nations lied to their people. Both systems engineered illusions to maintain control. Japan minimized the damage to preserve the myth of invulnerability. America maximized the success to keep morale alive. Neither population was shown the full ledger, the human cost, the strategic insignificance, the brutal aftermath. This was not accidental. This was deliberate manipulation. Understand the mechanics here. Propaganda does not need to match reality. It needs only to bend perception. When bombs fall, what matters is not just where they land, but how they are remembered. Tekiti, a hat, is why 3 dead airmen became nameless martyrs. That is why tens of thousands of slaughtered Chinese civilians were erased from official memory. Both sides sculpted reality like clay, stripping away what was inconvenient, amplifying what was useful. You live in the world built from these stories, and you must recognize the machinery behind them. Because once you understand propaganda as a weapon, sharper than steel, longer lasting than bombs, you begin to see that the Doolittle Raid was not just a strike against Tokyo. It was a strike against perception itself, and perception is where wars are truly won. The bombs had stopped falling, but the true storm was only beginning. For Japan's high command, the Doolittle Raid was not simply an insult, it was a revelation. If American bombers could pierce their skies once, they might do it again. And if Chinese villages had aided those crews, then the Chinese population itself became the enemy. This paranoia metastasized into fury, and fury into slaughter. The reprisals were swift, merciless, and hidden from Western eyes. Japanese troops swept across the provinces where Doolittle's men had landed, branding entire communities as traitors. Villages were torched to the ground. Civilians were executed in public squares. Wells were poisoned, crops burned, livestock butchered. Some estimates speak of 250,000 Chinese civilians dying in these waves of vengeance, an atrocity far larger than the raid itself. Yet in American history books, these massacres barely earn a footnote. The story America wanted was one of triumph, not the unintended genocide it triggered. And here lies the cruel paradox. A raid designed to boost morale at home ignited hell abroad. The men who flew the mission could not have known the price that innocent strangers would pay for their courage. But history is merciless. It tallies costs, whether acknowledged or not. Behind every photograph of smiling airmen in US newspapers, there are villages reduced to ash on the other side of the world. For Japan, the raid also carved a new strategic obsession. If the homeland was vulnerable, then their perimeter was not wide enough. Their empire needed to stretch further into the Pacific, to push American carriers back, to erect a wall of ocean and islands so vast that no bomber could cross it. This urgency drove them to plan the most ambitious naval strike yet, the invasion of Midway. They believed it would crush America's carrier fleet, erase the humiliation of Tokyo, and secure the empire once and for all. But they were no longer thinking rationally, they were reacting. They were being dragged into risk not by strategy, but by fear. And fear is the most treacherous general of all. So when you study the Doolittle Raid, do not only see brave men in flight, see the chain reaction, psychological shock, retaliatory massacres, reckless strategic gambles that reshaped the Pacific War. A handful of bombs over Tokyo did not merely scar a city. They unbalanced an empire, and they unleashed consequences too vast, too brutal, and too forgotten to fit into patriotic myth. June 1942. The Pacific is vast, but humiliation travels faster than waves. After the Doolittle Raid, Japan's leaders could not rest until the insult was erased. They chose Midway, a speck of coral atoll more than 2,000 miles from Tokyo, as the bait. The plan was audacious: lure the remaining American carriers into battle, annihilate them in one decisive strike, and restore the myth of Japanese invincibility. On paper, the plan gleamed with precision. 4 massive carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway while battleships waited in ambush. The Americans, humiliated and desperate, would rush to defend. Japan would spring the trap, destroy their carriers, and end the Pacific War before it could truly begin. Confidence surged through Tokyo's war rooms. Tojo promised the emperor that this operation would erase the shame of April. But beneath that confidence lay cracks. The raid had not only humiliated Japan, it had accelerated American resolve. Unknown to Tokyo, US cryptographers had broken portions of Japan's naval code. Every move, every false message, every fleet disposition was now whispered into Admiral Nimitz's ear. The Americans knew Midway was coming. They were not stumbling into a trap, they were setting one. Picture it. June 4th. Japanese carriers launch waves of bombers against Midway's defenses. Explosions rip across the atoll, but American aircraft strike back, wave after wave of fragile torpedo planes hurled into suicidal attacks. Most are slaughtered in the sky, their pilots burning before they ever reached their targets. From Tokyo's perspective, the battle seemed secure. But then came the moment. 30 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown breaking through the clouds. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers erupted in sheets of fire, their decks crammed with armed planes and fuel lines. Infernos so violent they turned to steel into liquid cascades. By nightfall, only Hiryu remained, launching desperate counterstrikes before she too succumbed to flames. 4 carriers, the pride of Japan's fleet, the very core of the Pearl Harbor strike force, were gone. In less than a day, Japan's naval supremacy was shattered, never to be regained. And the chain reaction that began with the Doolittle Raid had reached its ultimate explosion. Think about this. A raid dismissed as militarily insignificant pushed Japan into overreach. Overreach led to Midway, and Midway became the hinge of the Pacific War. From that moment forward, Japan was on defense, its empire crumbling inch by inch. A handful of bombers launched from a carrier deck in April had toppled the trajectory of nations by June. Back home, the Doolittle Raid was celebrated as pure legend. Headlines shouted of Tokyo in flames, and radio broadcasts painted vivid pictures of American bombers thundering over the Emperor's palace. Families cheered, newspapers sold out, and Roosevelt basked in the glow of renewed faith. To a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, it was more than news. It was salvation. But this legend was carefully curated. The truth, that the raid had caused only modest physical damage, that the crews were scattered, captured or killed, that Chinese civilians were slaughtered in reprisals, was buried beneath layers of patriotic ink. Propaganda thrives on selective memory, and America needed heroes, not martyrs, not massacres, not complexity. So the suffering was cut away, like an editor trimming film reels, leaving only the clean narrative of triumph. The families of the captured airmen received letters stripped of detail, words soaked in vagueness, missing in action, awaiting further news. They were not told of the cells, the starvation, the beatings, the executions. When survivors finally staggered home years later, their stories were whispered, sanitized, censored by military censors who feared the American public could not stomach the truth. And what of China? The Chinese villages that sheltered Doolittle's men paid in rivers of blood, but their story never crossed the Pacific. The massacres did not fit the legend. There were no victory parades for them, no monuments in Washington. Their sacrifice was expunged from the American memory, relegated to dusty archives and foreign testimonies. To this day, most Americans know nothing of the hundreds of thousands who died for a raid they never asked for. This is how national myths are forged, not from lies alone, but from omissions. By showing you only the fragments that inspire and concealing the fragments that horrify, leaders shape a memory stronger than truth. The Doolittle Raid became a myth of courage and daring, and in many ways it was, but it was also a story of torture, silence, and civilian slaughter. To honor only the myth is to betray the reality. Ask yourself, what is the cost of forgetting? When history is polished smooth, who pays the price of the rough edges that were cut away? The airmen who never came home knew the truth. The civilians who burned knew the truth. But the world was taught to remember only the roar of the engines, not the silence that followed. When the surviving Doolittle raiders returned, they were greeted not as men, but as symbols. They were paraded through streets, showered with medals, their faces plastered across newspapers as embodiments of courage. To the public, they were untouchable heroes. But inside, many carried a torment no parade could erase. Imagine surviving a crash landing in the Chinese mountains, stumbling through forests with broken bones, or bailing out into pitch-black night only to be hunted like prey. Imagine watching your comrades vanish into captivity, only to learn years later they had been executed or starved to death. And then, when you finally set foot on American soil, you are expected to smile, salute, and embody triumph. There was no space for grief, no room for guilt. The machinery of propaganda did not permit it. Some survivors confessed later in life that they struggled under the weight of their own myth. They had become characters in a story America wanted to believe, not the story they had truly lived. When they spoke of torture, their words were edited. When they hinted at the massacres in China, they were ignored. Their personal agony was swallowed by a legend polished to gleam. Even Jimmy Doolittle himself carried a private burden. Though celebrated as a national hero and eventually awarded the Medal of Honor, he believed the raid had failed. He had expected to be court-martialed upon return, convinced that losing all 16 planes outweighed the symbolic victory. Only later, when he saw how desperately America clung to the raid as a turning point, did he understand his role, not just as a commander, but as an icon crafted by necessity. And what of the men who survived Japanese prisons? They were broken in ways the public would never see. Malnourished, scarred, haunted, they returned to a country that needed them to embody resilience, not vulnerability. Their part in was buried beneath uniforms and ceremonies. Some spoke of it decades later, their voices shaking with the weight of memory. Others carried it silently to their graves, knowing the nation had no appetite for their truth. This is the cruelest paradox of myth-making. The more a story is sanctified, the less space there is for the messy human truth beneath it. The Doolittle Raiders were heroes, yes, but they were also men, scared, scarred, and sacrificed on the altar of morale. And sometimes, the greatest burden a soldier carries is not the mission itself, but the story others demand he live forever. Decades after the Doolittle Raid, the story still echoed, but not always as truth. Hollywood seized it first, transforming the raid into cinema. Clean dogfights, crisp uniforms, heroic speeches delivered without hesitation. Films like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo burned the raid into American memory, but through a lens scrubbed of agony. The tortured prisoners, the massacred Chinese civilians, the gnawing doubts, none of that made the screen. What survived was a legend, fearless men, noble sacrifice, victory snatched from the jaws of despair. It was history, rewritten in the language of entertainment. As the years passed, anniversaries became ceremonies. Surviving raiders gathered, their numbers dwindling with each decade, to clink silver goblets inscribed with their names. Newspapers wrote reverent features. Politicians invoked their courage as a symbol of American resolve. And for the public, the raid became not an event of blood and consequence, but a story of inspiration, something to be remembered with pride, not with discomfort. But commemoration is a double-edged blade. It preserves memory, yet it also freezes it into a shape that fits the needs of the present. America needed the raid to embody grit, so the survivors were framed as embodiments of perseverance, stripped of complexity. The deeper truths, the executions, the reprisals, the silences, were smoothed away, leaving a polished statue where once there had been flesh and bone. For the men themselves, remembrance was bittersweet. Some took solace in knowing their sacrifice had not been forgotten. Others bristled at the way their lives had been simplified into parables. A few, late in life, broke the silence, speaking of the darker corners, the agony of captivity, the guilt of unintended consequences, the endless night terrors. But these testimonies never spread as widely as the myths. Truth rarely competes with legend when legend is easier to love. Even today, memorials stand in their honor. Schoolchildren learn the sanitized version. Military museums display models of B-25 bombers soaring bravely off the carrier deck. The story endures, but not always the reality. And perhaps that is the greatest irony. The raid, meant to shatter illusions, ended up becoming one of the most carefully protected illusions in modern memory. History is not only written by the victors, it is curated by them. And in the case of the Doolittle Raid, the curation continues, decade after decade, shaping how generations understand not just the past, but the very nature of war itself. Strip away the medals, the parades, the polished documentaries, and what remains of the Doolittle Raid? Not a legend carved in stone, but a desperate gamble executed by men who knew the odds and still pressed forward. It was a mission born of vengeance, sharpened by desperation, and carried out with the cold understanding that survival was unlikely. That is the truth, raw and unembellished. The raid accomplished what it was meant to. It struck the Japanese homeland, shattered illusions of invincibility, and forced Tokyo to reorient its war strategy. But it also unleashed horrors unspoken in official histories. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were slaughtered in retaliation. Captured airmen endured starvation, torture, and execution. Families across America received telegrams that never made it into the victory speeches. And all of it was cloaked beneath a curtain of silence, because nations do not confess to the true cost of their victories. For Japan, the raid was a humiliation that cut deeper than the flames on Tokyo's rooftops. It planted fear inside the emperor's palace, a shadow that haunted the high command. That shadow drove Japan into reckless decisions, overextending in ways that would hasten its downfall. Yet for the American people, the raid was salvation of another kind, proof that their nation could strike back, that Pearl Harbor would not go unanswered, that the war was not hopeless. And so here lies the paradox. The Doolittle Raid was both triumph and tragedy, myth and massacre, salvation and damnation. A single thread of history, woven with blood and deception, still vibrating through time. Men were broken for it. Civilians were slaughtered because of it. Yet the world remembers it as a symbol of courage. This is how power operates, not by telling lies, but by deciding which truths are allowed to survive. So when you hear the story told, when you see the films, the textbooks, the documentaries, remember what they leave out. Remember that every myth is built on bones. And remember that the forbidden truths of war are not whispered to comfort you. They are whispered to awaken you. The Doolittle Raid was not just about bombers over Tokyo. It was about the illusion of safety shattered, the machinery of propaganda perfected, and the eternal question that lingers long after the smoke clears. What price are you willing to pay for victory, and how many ghosts must be buried before the world calls it honorable? By the war's end, the Doolittle Raid had become more than a mission. It was a weaponized memory. America held it up as proof of ingenuity, daring, and unbreakable spirit. Japan buried it in shame, pretending it had been insignificant, even as the wounds of humiliation reshaped their entire naval strategy. But the truth, the full truth, lived only in the shadows, passed quietly among veterans, buried in diaries, or hidden in classified files that only saw daylight decades later. History, as you are taught, it is never neutral. It is engineered. Every war story that survives does so because it serves a purpose, whether to inspire, to conceal, or to warn. The Doolittle Raid, sanitized and polished for mass consumption, was not preserved for your understanding. It was preserved for your conditioning. To believe in sacrifice without question. To honor courage without asking the price. To see victory without seeing the corpses that built it. But if you've listened this far, you're no longer the audience they designed. You are the outlier, the one who knows that under every legend lies a ledger. For every bomb dropped on Tokyo, thousands of civilians in China were butchered in retaliation. For every heroic film reel of pilots soaring into the Pacific sky, there were mutilated POWs whose screams were erased from the narrative. That is the other half of the raid, the half you were never supposed to know. This is how power operates. It lets you see just enough truth to keep your loyalty, while burying the details that might stir your doubt. It builds myths, then feeds them to your children until they harden into stone. And if you question them, you're told you're dishonoring the memory of the dead. But the dead don't need myths. They need justice. They need memory that cuts sharp, not soft. The Doolittle Raid was not just about aircraft and bombs. It was about control of perception. It was about how governments forge narratives strong enough to outlive the men who died for them. And once you see that pattern, you can never unsee it. You begin to understand that history itself is a battlefield, and the real war is for your mind. And now, the last veil lifts. The Doolittle Raid was never just about planes lifting off a carrier deck. It was about power teaching the world a lesson. Nations learned that perception is as deadly a weapon as bombs. Japan learned that no wall of distance could shield an empire from fire. America learned that a myth, once forged, could outlast steel, fuel, and flesh. And you, sitting here now, must learn the hardest truth of all. Wars are not fought only with weapons. They are fought with stories. Think of it. The pilots became immortal not because of what they destroyed, but because of how their story was told. The civilians who died, the men who were executed, the villages that burned, those stories were smothered, edited out of history. Silence became the second weapon, and it killed memory, just as surely as shrapnel killed bodies. This is the hidden architecture of war, a scaffolding of propaganda and half-truths designed to ensure that you believe what power wants you to believe. And here is the forbidden secret. You are not meant to hear this, but I will tell you anyway. The Doolittle Raid was not simply a strike against Japan. It was a strike against the minds of men. A reminder that fear can be sown like seed, that myths can be engineered like machines, that history itself can be commanded like an army. Once you know this, you cannot go back. You cannot unsee the machinery behind the curtain. So ask yourself, when you next hear a tale of war, are you hearing truth or the echo of a design? When a nation tells you of its courage, are you also hearing of its crimes? And when legends are handed to you like weapons, will you wield them blindly? Or will you finally see the blood still dripping from the handle? The Doolittle Raid ended in 1942. But the war for your perception, the battle to control what you believe about war, never ended. It rages still in classrooms, in films, in the headlines of your daily news. You have now seen the other side, the forbidden face of victory. And once you've seen it, you can never return to innocence. You can only move forward, sharper, darker, awake. The truth does not comfort. The truth changes you. And now, you are changed.